Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Today's episode, we're going to discuss volume, intensity, and frequency. So, let's kick it. To get it started, we want to define volume, intensity, and frequency in programming.
Volume, the amount of... Well, we always describe volume as the total amount of reps that we do within the A-series. Like, obviously, there's loads of different ways to do volume, but for us, you want to look at the A-series because at least at that stage, we're comparing like for like. If we're not looking at a wrist extension versus leg press. At least if we're looking at the A-series, we're going to be looking at big primary compound movements. So the total number of reps that we do across all our sets in the A-series is how we look at our overall volume. Intensity is the load we're working at in comparison to our 1RM. So our 1RM is always viewed as 100% intensity, and then every rep after that has an associated intensity. Generally, we'll be training anywhere between 70% and 100% because that is the established intensity zones that you get a very significant training response for strength and hypertrophy. 70% for most people equals about 12 repetitions. And then it goes up somewhat sequentially up to between 12 and 1 rep. And then frequency is either the amount of times we train per week or the amount of times we train the same muscle groups per week, depending on how specific we want to get into it.
Okay. And then when you're starting with a new client, which variable do you prioritize first?
I mean, it's hard to not prioritize intensity because it dictates the training response. So you need that's the first thing that we're going to plan for. For example, if you want to work on hypertrophy, well, we know that we can't train at an intensity of 90% and optimize a hypertrophy response. So we need to kind of figure that out first. And then the volume would be second. And then depending on the intensity and volume, then you figure out the frequency.
Intensity you prioritize because that's what you're looking at to establish what the periodization is to follow with the clients?
Well,
Well, typically it's the first thing that we determine, right? So if we want to do a hypertrophy block, we know what the intensity is, and then we can break it down.
But you just said it though, the intensity is not what we prioritize. The training goal is the priority. But out of the three things mentioned for the topic of this podcast, intensity is one. But in reality, you need to, what is the training goal that we're going to be training? Once you know the training goal, then
there's
need
certain intensities, volumes.
Exactly. So you need to know the goal first. That's the first thing. Then with that, then you figure out the intensity, and then you optimize the training goal by the appropriate volume prescription, where the volume prescription will be a reflection of the goal, yes, but also the individual trainee's ability to deal with the volume. Yeah. So the intensity is pretty fixed for a training goal, but the volume is what we're going to play with to truly individualize the prescription. And then also we could push along the intensity in the sense that depending on the neural ability of the trainee within a given intensity, then we can have a different loading pattern which will display this intensity in different manners. So the more neurally advanced you are, the more you need to trick the brain at dealing with a given intensity, and the more or the less training age you have, the more you have to be more straightforward with how that intensity is displayed. So that has more to do with rep scheme and like loading pattern within a given intensity.
You kind of already answered the next question I was going to say, but I'm still going to ask it so we can go into it a little bit further. So do you think there's a hierarchy among these variables, or are they context dependent?
Well, like I said, the hierarchy is you need to establish the intensity first. So that's the number one factor out of these three. Number 2, volume. Number 3, frequency. So that would be the hierarchy in terms of...
Yeah, but they all have to be looked at in context with each other, because there's no point having the right intensity. So say we're trying to get a hypertrophy response and we're training at 70%, but we're going to do one set. Okay, like it's going to be what it's going to be. It's not going to be optimal. But say, okay, we've got our intensity right, or say we get our volume right. All right, we're going to be doing 50 total reps, but our intensity's wrong. We're training at 50%. Okay, it's not optimal. Okay, then we've got both of them right. We've got our volume right. We've got our intensity right. We're doing 50 total reps with 70% of our 1RM, but we're doing it once every 3 weeks. All right, not going to do much. So they all have to be looked in combination, but on a planning perspective, it definitely has a hierarchy. So it depends on if you're looking at it on a plan perspective or importance, because it's 2 different things. Yeah. On importance, they're all equally important, because if you fuck up one of them, it's all fucked up. Whereas on a planning perspective, you definitely go intensity, volume, frequency.
So in terms of when you're looking at increasing volume or intensity, are there certain signs you look for with your clients?
Intensity is very, very straightforward. So in standard strength training, we have like basically 4 main training target. We have hypertrophy, absolute strength, relative strength, power. Now, each one of these 4 has a very specific intensity bracket that you need to adhere to in order to emphasize a training response. So hypertrophy, you know that the average of your macro cycle, I'm not talking about one meso, I'm not talking about one phase. I'm talking about the average of all of the phases used in the context of your macro cycle for hypertrophy. The average should fall in between 75 to 80%. So now, because this is the average, now we know, and let's say our macro has 4 mesos, so we know that our mesos individually can be outside of these targets in terms of intensity, but as long as the average of your macro, of the time spent within that macro, falls between 75 to 80%, then you know that your training response will have a hypertrophy bias. Absolute strength, it's the same idea, but now the average intensity is a little higher. It's like 80 to 85. Then relative strength, same concept, but even higher intensity, 85 to 90. Then power is the trickiest of them all, because it depends on the quality that you're training with power. If you're training explosive strength, starting strength, or reactive strength, well, these training modalities require different intensities. Like, for example, starting strength, it's all about your ability to recruit a ton of motor units in the early stages of your concentric action. So the load is very, very light, but the velocity is super high. So the intensity is not necessarily created by the load on the barbell. It is created more by the velocity at which you're displaying that load on the barbell. And that's what's giving you your intensity response. So it gets a little trickier, because if we're looking at Carmelo Busco's like intensity continuum, like starting strength could be as low as 20%. But this is only for the performance of that starting strength exercise. So it's not necessarily like the session that's a 20% intensity. So now it gets a little confusing. So the only way that us as coaches or educator, we can kind of like translate a power training program to our usual intensity prescription is by using our typical intensity number for the one maximal strength exercise that we will be doing in our power session. So that's why it gets misleading sometimes, because on average power, we train it at 85 to 90, just like we do relative strength. But we're talking about a low volume of a maximal strength exercise within the training session. We're not, if you see us talk about 85 to 90 for power, we're not saying that power is exclusively trained at 85 to 90%.
Yeah.
That's not true, because power can be trained like at almost any intensity. It really depends on what you're targeting. So we're always talking, we always have a multi-joint compound max strength exercises in mind when we're talking about intensity. That's why Porrick was saying earlier that we only truly care about that A series multi-joint compound movement, so that we can actually compare training modalities from meso to meso or macro to macro within a training year.
Well, and then I'm sure it also goes into, we're using that exercise because for us, that's at the start of the session, and the fatigue from that then affects the rest of the session. So it applies primarily on the primary compound movements.
Well, yeah, that's true, because even if we know that the 1RM continuum, first of all, is meant to be done on multi-joint compound lift, but the fatigue component is also one of the reasons why, like in your C series, if we're calling for 10 reps, well, we know that a C series 10 rep is not necessarily 74% of 1RM, because if you've done 6 sets in your A series, 3 to 4 sets in your B series, there's so much cumulative fatigue that there's no way that by the time you get to that C, that whatever exercise you're doing will be a true fresh 10 RM. Yeah. So we can't really at that point use the continuum. So you have to be more, you have to recognize that situation, and you have to be more focused on getting the RM load, whatever that might be. Like at that point in mind, if you see 10 reps and you're using 65% of a fresh 1RM, so be it. It doesn't matter. At this point, anyways, the nature of your assistance and remedial are more hypertrophy biased anyways. So we're looking to train more at maximal voluntary contraction, so concentric failure. So whatever that load is, it is what it is. You're still going to get the training response. But because the A series, because the quality of work is so much more important, the intensity needs to be you need to do due diligence at making sure that you're providing the appropriate intensity and the appropriate load on a RM component, so that you're actually truly training the training effect you're going for. Like there's a huge neural component. You need, like if you're doing like 3 reps, you need to make sure that you're tapping into high threshold motor units. So it's not like poor quality works and on and on and on and on. So the intensity really is a series multi-joint compound lift thing, and that's why we're always talking about the maximal strength exercise. It doesn't matter what the goal is between these 4 goals that I talked about earlier. Like the intensity is what will be dictated by that A series.
I do find that that's something like what you were just talking about, that some trainers, it takes them a little bit longer to understand in selecting the loads for the B series, because they get so hung up on the percentages, and then they try to apply that to the entirety of the session, and even like they overthink strength ratios to a component when it comes to the B and the C series, but you can't, because it's in a training session. You do have that fatigue from the A series. So it's almost like going back to the question, even though it doesn't really work in terms of the primary, but when do you know it's time to increase volume versus intensity? Like it kind of applies a little bit more to the rest of the workout.
Yeah, like people really do struggle with that. Like if they would get so much more benefit from forgetting intensities and just working towards RM loads, that it takes that complexity out of it. And then it's simple, because our rep prescription doesn't change massively in our B and C series. Like there is a fluctuation, but it's not a huge variation. So it's not like our volume is going to be massively different on a phase-to-phase perspective at that time. So all you have to do is think about, I'm just trying to increase the load that I am able to complete a rep max value at. So if it's 10 RM, I'm just trying to increase that load over time. And it's very straightforward. It's very simple. But if you're starting to get overly confused by, the last time they did 10 reps, they're only able to use 66%. So this time we're going to try and go up 2%. So it's going to be 67. Doesn't matter. Yeah. Just go up to the next set of dumbbells. Yeah. Go to RM failure. Great. Okay. Next time, try and beat it. Like it doesn't have to be overly complicated. Just continuously strive to beat your logbook.
But you're right in saying that people struggle with it, but in reality, it should be the easiest thing. It should be like you only need one set to figure it out. And it's not that you cannot use the strength ratios. The strength ratios are really useful when you have no idea to kind of give you a first step. So, for example, let's say we're doing a elbow out, like a bent over elbow out row one arm. Okay, well, we know that it should be about 37% of your neutral grip one arm dumbbell row, which is a more common movement. Okay, so you have no idea. All right, so I'll use 37% of my bench as a starting point, and then you go at it. So let's say you're supposed to do 10 reps. Well, and you're supposed to train to concentric failure. So the sheet says 10 reps. But if you reach 10 and you still have like 5 reps in the bank, go for it. Okay, now I did 15 reps. It was supposed to be 10. I did 15. So now technically I'm about 8% lower intensity than what I should be at. So I'll go up 8% for the next set, and you should be pretty much at it. And then in set number 2, you still go to failure. I did 11 reps. Okay, well, I can go up again just a little bit. But then by workout 1, you should be right on to whatever that 10 RM is. And then this workout 2, you start your set 1 with that 10 RM load you've established the week prior, and then you try to do 10 for all 3-4 sets. If you do, then you go up. If you don't, then you stick and you try to do the reps. It's
when you were working with
simple.
one-on-one clients, is that a lot of the times when you would get to the B and C series, would you do that? So say it's a newer client or you're still establishing the loads because it is a new program or anything. Do you have them do more reps if you see that the weight is too light? Like, would you have them through the session do more?
And that's the hardest part with people, because they always want to stop at whatever rep you tell them, but you just have to get them to fail, especially on that first exposure to that exercise for that program, or else you can waste like a whole 3-week meso if you don't nail it on the first one. But I mean, even if when you're training someone, like I would always tell my clients, it's like, the goal is 10. We need to find the weight. But if you feel that you can do more, then we're going to continue. But like, don't fake it. A lot of people just be like, they just stop.
But then a lot of the time, if you can see within the first rep or two, it's like, oh, this is way too light. Just stop them. Stop. All right, that's one rep set. We'll go up 10 pounds. Like you can tell that moved easy as hell, and just like, all right, we can reestablish here, because in the end of the day, you have to use your best assumption. They've never done this lift. They're probably going to not have a clue if you ask them like what they think they can do. Like, they have no concept of that. So you have to use your best guess and then just use your coaching eye from there.
With frequency, does it only apply, like when you're saying frequency, is it just the sessions per week is what the frequency is, or frequency applies to more within the program?
I mean, frequency can be so many things. Like, it can be the amount of sessions per meso, the amount of sessions per micro, or the amount of times a specific session is repeated, or the amount of time a specific exercise is repeated. So it's a multifactorial. Like, so it kind of depends. Like, for example, with the Hypertrophy Specialization online course, there's a microcycle structure or a training split that I like that has variable exposure per week for each body part. For example, 1 week, chest and back is trained twice. Another week, it's trained once. But if you look at the frequency on a meso perspective, then we have chest and back and arms and shoulders that are trained 4 times in 3 weeks. And we have lower body quad dominant, which is trained 3 times. And we have lower body posterior chain that's trained 3 times as well. So it's a uneven distribution on a micro perspective. But at the end of the meso, then we have an even distribution of 4 exposures for upper body workouts and 3 exposures for lower body workouts. So that's why I'm saying it goes beyond just how many workouts per week you're doing.
Yeah. what are the important factors when you're prescribing volume for specific clients?
So volume, you need to look at the training goal first of all. So the training goal will always give you an indication of how much volume you kind of need to prescribe. So hypertrophy, you're always going to need a little bit more volume, whereas power on the flip side, you'll need the least amount of volume, because training power, training speed and velocity in a state of fatigue becomes counterproductive. So you need enough volume to stimulate a strength response, or at least maintaining maximal strength, but you don't want so much that you're creating enough fatigue that your contraction velocities cannot reach the velocities that you're supposed to reach in order to drive that power response. So it's a fine line. Now, you have general guidelines. What I always say when you start with a new client, especially if you don't really know their background, start with the lowest possible volume for the training goal that you're going after. I'm a huge believer in a minimum effective dose first. So if, like, for example, a general strength hypertrophy accumulation phase, we like volumes that fall in between the 40 to 60 total reps for that A series. So 5x12, which would be a 70% intensity, so the minimum threshold of intensity, but 60 total reps, so 5 sets of 12, 60 total reps. So now this would be the highest amount of volume that we would prescribe, 5x12. On the flip side, 3x12, which is 36 reps, would be the lowest, right? I said 40 to 60, but let's be real, like, as long as you're close to that target, you're fine. But so how do we determine this? Well, okay, so if it's somebody that has a very low training age, or that you really don't know much about that client, I'm not going to go at 5x12 and then risk creating a huge recovery dip, a dip in the recovery curve, where now, by the time we're getting back to the second stimulus of the same thing, he's not overcompensated. So now all you're doing is you're draining and draining and draining and draining that trainee, instead of forcing a positive adaptation or creating a stimulating training protocol. So I'll start at 3x12 and then see, okay, we're 3x12. How does the client feel? Does he feel energized or recovered like a few days after? Or does he still feel like he's drained? If he's drained and you start at such a low volume, then at one point you need to start thinking outside of the box. So what's going on? Is there something in his lifestyle that makes it that even that minimum dose of volume is too much for him to recover? Is it sleep? Is it stress? Is it poor nutrition? Is the overall training frequency per week too much for this client at this point in time? So maybe we need to reduce the training frequency from 4 to 3 and see what happens. So at that point, like, you need to become a coach and, try different, look at different outcomes and try them and see if the client is doing better. Now, if the client is doing well and he's recovering and performance, like the strength increases in a somewhat linear fashion from week to week for a certain amount of time, you know that you're on the right track. So you don't need to drive more volume. You know that a lower volume prescription at this point in time is doing its job. So as you move on to the intensification phase, now with hypertrophy, we're talking about like the 20 to 40 total rep. Well, if I'm sticking to the lower volumes, well, my intensification, I'll stick to the lower volume as well. So I'll use a set and rep protocol that puts me in that 20-ish rep range. And then you keep going that way. And then you keep going with low volume as long as you have a positive training response. Now, eventually, you're going to start seeing plateaus in strength increase. So, but plateaus, you have to be careful, because it can be a thing where, okay, one phase I plateaued, I didn't gain strength. well, it might be a fluke, it might be circumstantial. So you need to confirm that. So stick to low volume again for one more meso, and then look at what happens. If now there's still a plateau, now you need to make a decision as a coach. And usually at this point in time, maybe now that trainee needs more volume to create a stimulating outcome. So now we'll bump the volume to medium range. And so now your accumulation are in that 50 reps and your intensification are in that 30 rep window. And then usually that mid-range, people are going to make progress for a while. But ultimately, if, like what I've noticed through my 26-year career as a coach is the better, or the more the trainee is able to have the appropriate lifestyle and nutrition and recovery mode and ability to deal with the highest amount of volume, the higher the potential is.
Yeah.
So if you want somebody to be really, really, really jacked, really, really, really strong, well, you know that you kind of need to make it so that your average volume can be over time closer to the higher end. Like there's no denying that people who can cope with higher volume of work will always have a higher average training outcome just because they can deal with more work.
And that ties into what we always talk about when we refer to building a work capacity. That work capacity is the ability to handle increases in volume over time. And then it makes me think of the long-term periodization database we have. Yeah. We have it so there's low, medium, and high. And I know some people tend to get confused because we group it sometimes in the novice, intermediate to advanced. But it can't just be the training age sometimes, because it is their ability to recover from those training factors as well. So you kind of have to get to know the client to know what they can handle. But the goal is the better you are at recovering and the better you can handle it, you do want to push those levels of volume.
Yeah, like realistically, the most elite athletes are the ones that can handle the highest amount of workload. Like that is the ones that thrive. They really are the ones that go out and end up having very successful careers. But in the end of the day, you have to realize they are the outliers. Yeah. Not everyone's going to get there. So while our goal is always to try and push more and more work capacity and their ability to increase their volume tolerance, and they'll always be able to get better to a certain extent, not everyone's going to reach those high volumes. That's why we're saying start low and push as needed. But it's not everyone's going to get to the super high end of the volume spectrum. Like not everyone is genetically gifted enough to be able to handle that. And then you have to be somewhat careful, because if someone's super well neurologically wired, those high ends of the volume spectrum probably aren't as beneficial as someone who's slightly less neurally wired. Just because if you have the ability to tap into a ton of motor units right from the get-go, that's going to drain your recovery. Yeah. So there is a little bit of give and take there as well.
But
and when you deal with like your gen pop who are really high stress, volume is definitely the thing that you need to manipulate the most, because they won't be able to tolerate it. So even if they have been training for a long time, but that goes back to the lifestyle factors that you were talking before, you still want to be able to train them at high intensities, or even, whatever, like high or low intensities, but you need to manipulate the volume more so that they can recover from it.
Yeah, I mean, volume is definitely the most malleable component out of these, out of frequency, intensity, and volume. But I lost a little bit of my train of thought or where I wanted to go. But
I was going to say a lot of trainers that don't necessarily use program design or periodization, when you really take a step back and you look at how they program a lot of volume, but they don't pay attention to the intensity. Yeah. They're not paying attention to the actual load that's being used. It's just always pushing volume without paying attention to the intensity at all. So that's why you see a lot of people doing high reps with a weight that's not really driving the intensity.
Yeah, just creating more work for people is always going to give the illusion of
working out.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very easy solution if you're not going to periodize and program design.
So like Porg was saying that like the best athletes are the one who can cope and deal with the highest amount of volume. But prescribing volume is very straightforward and somewhat simple. Okay, so you start with low volume. You look at the strain adaptation. So there's just so much strength you can add. Like once you're advanced, you can only gain about 2 to 2.5% strength per training session. So it's not like if low volume allows you to gain 2.5% strength per week, it's not like all of a sudden driving more volume will lead to a 5% gain. You'll see 5% gain for the the novices, where a lot of their strength response is a reflection of early stage hypertrophy and intermuscular coordination. But once you're high, intermediate, or advanced, like there's only a certain amount of protein synthesis you can generate per day and only so much strength you can actually gain. So if low volume gives me this, why would I drive higher volume? And that's the problem, because a lot of people too early, they go to higher volumes only to get a 2% strength response. But now at the day that now they're plateauing because they adapted to that high volume, then where do you go? Now you need to drive even more volume. So then it gets to a point where the volume is so high that now you start seeing like injuries, tweaks, pattern overload, because now there's just too much volume. But one thing that's important is, like I said, volume is relatively simple. It's very straightforward. You have your A series, number of sets, number of reps. You look at total reps, you manipulate that. But the reason why we have the comprehensive periodization course was to show the students that at one point, if you're high, intermediate, or advanced and your training age is 4+, at one point, okay, you're at high volume, but now you're strong as hell. So what do we do now? I'm not going to drive more volume, but now you start being lethargic because your recovery is affected. But then you have to be careful to not drop volume like on a permanent basis. You can drop volume for a meso, you can drop volume for a week, but you have to be careful to drop volume for an extended period of time, because now you might have an involution effect, like a detraining effect. So at that point, now you need to become more clever. Okay, well, how can I try to stay at higher volume but manage the training prescription so that that trainee can still recover from that stressor? And this is where the different periodization model comes into play. So now it becomes a question of, okay, how can we manipulate the parameters, the frequency, the training session structure, the exercise selection in order to optimize the recovery? Because at the end of the day, the only reason why we use periodization in training, it's to make sure that we're managing fatigue, to make sure that we're optimizing the fitness fatigue paradigm from Zatsiorsky so that we can actually train to train, but then get to a point where we can express fitness without being fatigued all the time. And in order to do this, you need somewhat of a periodized plan so that we have phases of overreaching, phases of unloading, so that we can generate overcompensation. But there's different ways to do this than just simply look at volume. So that's why the different models that we teach, like the daily undulating periodization, the weekly periodization, the uncoupled DUP, the coupled DUP, the single wave, the double waves, they're all ways to get to that training goal, but dispatch or expressed in such ways that now, depending on the individual, well, this model will create the stimulus we want, but it's clever in its distribution of modalities so that we can actually get better recovery and get higher peaks in training. So that's why at one point, just looking at volume becomes a little counterproductive, and you need to go beyond and start interjecting different periodization model to push the envelope.
Yeah, like a really easy example to come off that is, like, since I've changed to a daily undulating model, I can handle probably about 15% more volume across my macro than I could on a phase undulating model. Like, I was definitely getting to the point that phase undulating was really, really taxing my recovery. And come like week 10 of the 12, I was starting to struggle. But now, daily undulating with more volume, I'm still progressing a lot better. So it really can have a huge impact on your recoverability, even at the higher volumes, is just manipulating the stressors and how they're imposed.
And when you're getting to those, when you're more advanced, you're stronger, you've been training for a longer period of time, that's then when you can also use those buffers. Wouldn't that kind of play into it as well?
Yeah, it definitely can. So buffers, when we talk about buffers, we're talking about the how far away we are training from our RM load. So if the prescribed percentage for that phase is 70% and we're only doing 6 reps, that is, we're 13% away from our RM load. So 6 reps generally represented by 83% on the 1RM continuum. So 83 is 13% away from 70. So we have a 13% buffer. So if we're going to use buffers, we are going to prescribe a greater total amount of sets with sub-maximal loads. So we're going to try do 70% with 6 reps, and then we're going to use the total amount of sets to reach our volume target. So
basically, you're still sticking to the same volume, but you're exposing your body to differently.
Yeah, say your goal was 36 reps, so it's 3 sets of 12 if you're doing if you're using 70%. Instead of doing 3 by 12, we could do 6 by 6, but do that 6 by 6 at 70%. So we're still, the intensity of the meso is still the goal. The total volume of the meso we're still hitting, but we're just displaying in a different way. And since no set's being brought to failure, we're not going to dip our recovery curve as much. So it's going to allow us to train at a higher frequency and keep recovery a lot better. So we can, it's going to allow us to express our strength anytime we move back into a more maximal expression.
And another sneaky component about this that's really, really cool that you can't disregard is the more advanced you are. Now, all of these reps, so 36 reps of volume. Now with the 13% buffer Pork is talking about, now these 36 repetitions are way higher average quality than if they were performed with 3 by 12. So if you're trying to improve neural factors and you're trying to improve your ability to tap in high threshold motor units, so we know that the highest threshold motor units are at 2x. But the 2x, you can only tap into them with high velocities. So now if I'm doing 6 repetitions at 70%, well, now these 6 reps are relatively easy, which allows me to generate way faster concentric contraction speed. So I'm able to tap into higher average motor units through the performance of these 36 reps than if I were to do 12 reps to failure, where I'm grinding out the last couple of reps. And the first few reps, I'm tapping into lower threshold motor units because the first few reps are so easy, but the total duration of the set is so long that my concentric contraction speed can never be as fast as if I'm doing all of my reps fresher. So it's a sneaky way. You're getting your volume, but you're getting higher quality contraction.
And then I know for our listeners, because I know some of you have attended our comprehensive courses where we discuss this, we're not going to go into all the details with it, but when you're using buffers, then you do have to manipulate the rest differently than what the normal rest would be. Have
to is a strong word. Should, to make sure it's done within a more reasonable time frame. Yes, you could definitely train with buffers and have 4 minutes recovery. It's just going to take you a long time to achieve your total volume. But so then we can manipulate our rest. But it's okay because we're creating less intra-set fatigue. So every time we complete a set, since it's so far away from actual failure, it's not going to take as long to recover anyway. So you're going to be able to replicate that effort way quicker than working up to a true like 12 RM like we were saying there. So it's not as big a deal.
Go.
So it's something that we recommend more for the advanced person. I'm just like thinking of it now. Wouldn't it be a great way also for a new person that's trying to learn like a new motor pattern, and you still want to get all that volume in there, so you can still do like the same amount of volume, but at a...
Yeah, that's kind of how we teach the novice in the fat loss specialization, like section 1 of the novice structure. That's kind of how we do it without necessarily using the word buffer. Yeah. It's kind of what it is, because we kind of limit our reps to 6-ish, but we're just, we're having the client start with a much lighter weight than you just do a linear rise and load, but you maintain 6 reps, and then you're just improving quality and quality and quality until that 6 reps becomes an actual 6 RM.
Yeah, and like this, so this is the way I like to train people the first time they're learning these motor patterns. And since they're novice, we obviously don't have a 1 RM to base it on, we can't then use exact buffers, but then you just choose a load that's going to challenge their posture and positioning, but still allow for extremely high quality movement, and then terminate the exercise if you can no longer cue them into good quality movement, so fatigue is becoming an issue. But using sub-maximal loads for a higher quantity of sets is a fantastic way to train the novice or novice trainee for more complex movement patterns.
I know we're actually removing the lecture you give, Steph, on monitoring training loads from the course, just because we found that we need to spend more time covering a lot of the content. So we're removing that. We'll most likely use it in the future for another education platform. But I do think that when you're manipulating these variables and getting to know your clients, that those become like monitoring the training loads to see how they're responding to all these variables becomes really important.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, in my opinion, you can't really do a great job at adjusting planning if you don't track or monitor training loads, because training loads, like you have external and internal factors, right? So it can be like the volume load of the training, the frequency of the training. It can be your lifestyle, your sleep, your nutrition, stress. All of this is affecting how you're dealing with the training loads. So if you're starting noticing that the average perceived exertion of each session is super high and the readiness score is super low, and this is not a fluke, it keeps happening for a week, 2 weeks, now 3 weeks, then now you're going into a trend. You're going into a place where if you're not adjusting the training loads, which is usually from the training, it's usually a reflection of volume load. If you're not adjusting this, then you know that you're it's a ticking time bomb. Like the training, it will crash, the strength will go down, injuries are most likely going to happen. So you need to track it. You need to make sure it's something you address.
Next question. So, are there any studies or methodologies that changed your perspective on volume, intensity, or frequency?
Change, no, but confirm, yeah. So, I've always been a somewhat of a big fan of volume for hypertrophy purposes, but in the last 2-3 years, there's been like kind of a resurgence in the good old like basically Mike Menzer's heavy duty type of protocol. It's not as hardcore with the low frequency like. Yeah. Menzer, some of his protocol was 1 session every 2 weeks, but in terms of like volume per session, but what's interesting is a lot of recent research from 21, 22, 23 done on hypertrophy do show like very clearly how higher volume loads can lead to a greater hypertrophy response. So that to me was kind of interesting to read all of these more recent study to kind of confirm some of the protocols that I've been doing my entire career, especially with my the most of the mentors that I've had, from Nelson Ayat, André Benoit, and Charles Poliquin, like they've always been higher volume kind of guys, at least for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So of course my training has reflected that. Even my own personal training, I've been through phases in my lifting career where volume was pretty, like volume and frequency was pretty high.
Yeah.
And I've reached some pretty decent numbers, but so for me, it was more of a confirmation bias type of thing that was refreshing.
Yeah, like I think the big thing is we've seen what has stood the test of time. Like there has been a lot of like just normal principles that have stuck around for a long, long time because they work. So like we know if we want to improve a lift, train that lift somewhat frequently is really beneficial. But obviously you can only train it to the frequency that you can recover from. So it's either you're going to train it 1, 2, or 3 times a week. If you're going to train at really high frequency, you're going to have to manipulate some sort of variables. If you're going to train at really low frequency of once a week, you're going to have to make sure it's trained maximally. Like, so there's definitely, like, there's been trends, but it's the best practices that stick around.
Yeah.
So,
But that's like, this is actually a point I wanted to bring up. Like I was thinking of bringing it up at the end when you say anything to add to the.
Well, we're approaching that time.
But this is an important point that I think a lot of coaches completely disregard because the research completely disregard it. So you have certain studies that have been done that looked at volume on a weekly volume distribution perspective. So let's say we're using our 60 reps for hypertrophy, so our maximal volume rep for accumulation phases. So you could do 60 reps in one session on one movement, or you could do 30 reps on one movement done twice a week, or you could do 20 reps on one movement 3 times a week. Okay. And the latter is something that's used like frequently now. Like people are like, well, let's increase the frequency but decrease the volume
per session,
but we're going to match the volume per week. And the study shows very similar results in terms of hypertrophy over their 8 to 12 week period, like, which is the time frame often used in these studies. So then it seems like it makes a lot of sense to be like, well, if it yields the same results, instead I'll do 2 sets of 10 on incline press 3 times a week to hit my volume target instead of doing 5 sets of 12 1 time a week. Cool. But the problem, and I think that's one aspect that they don't talk about because they don't study it. It's not part of the study. But we were saying earlier that the best athletes in anything that I've seen my entire career, so does my mentor, have always been people able to cope to higher volumes. And the problem is, if your sessions are always 2 by 10, you never get to a point where the athlete or the trainee needs to cope with the demands of higher work capacity.
Yeah.
So you never truly teach the athlete to improve their work capacity because they have nothing to cope from. The stressor, like doing 5 sets of 12 in one session on back squat is drastically more draining than 2 sets of 12.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, it is an important thing to coach, to teach, or to go through as a client, as a trainee. You need to have the mechanism in place to be like, okay, now body, nervous system, recover from these 5 by 12 of squat.
Yeah.
Like recover from it, replenish glycogen storage. There's so much on a biochemical perspective that happens from that type of stressor. The hormonal response from the training is different. And I understand that hormone response from training is very acute, but it's still something you need to cope with. The energy demands are different. Like there's so many things that are different that it goes outside of the scope of just how much protein synthesis did you generate on the vastus lateralis over 8 weeks. There's more things. And because I come from more of a athletic performance background, these things are very important to me. Because when you're an athlete and you're playing a game and you're an O-line, you need to exert a lot of force, but not just for 2 plays. You need to exert a lot of force for multiple plays over one game,
and then recover from it, and then get ready for the next game.
Yeah, so it's a skill that you need to build. So sometimes you need to go beyond the study and the tunnel vision of what the goal of that study is, and also look at training for what training is, and knowing that, okay, I'm doing 12 reps, cool. Yes, I'm having a hypertrophy bias, but I'm training this athlete to become a better athlete. So I want this athlete to actually have true work capacity and also to be able to recover from the demands that I'm putting the athlete in. So it's just like food for thought. But I think it's important for coaches to understand that when it comes to training, there's so many things that you need to consider whenever you're prescribing your sessions.
Different variables, yeah. I mean, it goes back to what we're always saying and I know you just said it, how the whole tunnel vision of viewing strength training only for hypertrophy. Like we train, we want hypertrophy, we do, but we want hypertrophy, we want strength, we want to perform. It's not, you can't just look at that one tunnel vision of hypertrophy. And then it's the same thing with the studies, or even now when you see people getting more into the less volume for the training. Again, it's a disservice to a lot of the younger trainers and trainees, because if you've been training for years and years and years, you have built muscle mass, you are more advanced in strength training, you're still going to have a different outcome by doing that type of training versus someone that has no training background and hasn't established and hasn't built any muscle. So I think it's really important to not just hear that one thing and then apply it to
like
your
the
training.
problem with it seemed like, because I know like one of our students like asked me like, hey, why you hate on hypertrophy so much? I don't hate on hypertrophy.
Love hypertrophy.
Like hypertrophy, like that's like being muscular is what drove me to start weight training in the first place when I was 11 years old. I love hypertrophy, but to me as a strength coach and someone who's been studying strength training for like 30 something years, hypertrophy is so simple. It's the easiest thing to get from programming. It's not a complicated thing. What is complicated though, which requires so much more minutia on programming, is like everything that's all the neural factors, the ability to recruit more motor units, the ability to improve firing rate, the ability to tap into super high threshold motor units, the ability to train at IMCA on every freaking rep of your A series and not forget about it. Like these are so much more complex than just hypertrophy. So that's why, to me, whenever we're talking about strength training and the only outcome potential from strength training is hypertrophy, to me it's so kindergarten that it's just it's boring.
Well, it goes back to the greatest expression of jackness. A lot of people would just hear that and think it's only hypertrophy, but I remember, Porrick, we made that post where it really broke down like what jackness is to us, and jackness isn't just purely being jacked and being, it's like the ability to express your jackness.
What people don't know is that post was censored because it was a lot more aggressive before that.
We have our versions in-house. That could be something we can share within our private forum one day. Okay. So you already shared your final thoughts. Does anyone else have any final thoughts on volume, intensity, frequency, or any other topics that came up this episode?
Upper, lower, 4 times a week. Works.
I have a final thought though. Like, volume is great, and I think everybody should thrive for more volume, but not garbage volume, not trash volume.
Yeah.
Unless you're going like full blast, like pure metabolic. But if general strength is the main idea of your training, it cannot be garbage volume. It needs to be high quality, targeted volume. But if you take a slow approach and you start with low volume and you build it up to medium volume and you increase your ability to recover and you increase your work capacity, and then you can train a higher volume for a little bit, I mean, the rewards are high, but it needs to be high quality stuff.
Yeah. And then just to back on that, it doesn't all have to be high volume. Make sure you do your relative strength phases where volumes drop so you get really better at the neurological factors as well. Because, I mean, you go back to higher volume, you're going to get even better results.
Yeah, I mean, that's a super important point. The inverse relationship between intensity and volume, the fact that all of our training is planned and periodized. We tend to, all of us, when we start with a client, we actually have a 4-year plan in terms of intensity fluctuations, which means that we have built in by default huge fluctuation in volume prescription. So all of this is all thought of in the long run. It's not like we're like, okay, well, we're going to do 60 reps on our primaries for the next year. That's not how it works. But when you do have phases or macros where the average volume is higher, you milk the hell out of it, but then you need to back off. That's also why with our hypertrophy specialization course, we drive a lot of volume within that 12-week cycle, but what do we always tell students to do after? Revert back to a strength macro so the average volume is much lower so that you can actually like overcompensate from that 12-week of a quote-unquote extreme volume with the hypertrophy specialization.
Thanks for tuning in. Submit your topics and questions in the link below.